If your websites conduct transactions or collect sensitive data, you have a material risk on your hands that could cost millions. The client-side security gap is being exploited daily with attacks like digital skimming, credential harvesting, and form jacking. 98% of sites use first and third-party JavaScript to power and enhance the user experience, opening up the client side to the adversary. Unlike most things in security, there is an easy fix. Start by understanding your risk. Let Source Defense give you a site-wide risk report this week. Visit securityweekly.com/source defense. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. It's going to be back here on the Security News. If you've got a specific guest or topic you'd like us to cover on one of the upcoming shows, go to securityweekly.com/guests. Make that submission. We review those every week here at Security Weekly. Another announcement. Join us June 29th for a webcast with Tyler Robinson and Bo Bullock to learn how to pivot into the world of crypto security. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast where Tyler and Bo will go through things such as blockchain, cryptocurrency, and all the things you need to know about. Maybe not all, but like a lot. These guys are like really nerding out on all things blockchain and cryptocurrency. So you're going to want to tune into that, whether you've been following it closely or not at all, or somewhere in between. I think there's going to be great information. I've learned so much just listening to Bo and Tyler talk about what they're going to be talking about. So that is a resounding endorsement. So make sure you check out that webcast. Again, go to securityweekly.com/webcast. Thanks for doing that, Tyler and Bo. It's awesome stuff.
Yeah. It's going to be fun.
I have an announcement. If you've been following social media, you know I've got some announcements. So I'll start at the beginning, as it were. So a while ago, I resigned from the Cyber Risk Alliance. Now it sounds like really like a really like bad thing or whatever, right? But as all of us know, you know, acquisitions happen. People move around.
And for the record, Cyber Risk Alliance is the owner of
Acquired Security Weekly.
Yep. So
Correct.
owns the podcasts and so forth.
Right. So I've resigned my position at the Cyber Risk Alliance, and I've accepted and started now a new position as the firmware security evangelist for a company called Eclipsium. Now, our listeners may be familiar with Eclipsium. We've had them on the show in the past. They were a sponsor. That's how I got to know some of the team. And when I was figuring out what I wanted to do next in my life, I had to be honest. Like, they were at the tops of my list because we always just had amazing conversations. And now I'm a full-time, excuse me, part of the Eclipsium team, working on all things firmware security related and taking that message back out to the community and talking about it, similar to my role that I held at Tenable Network Security for a while. And it's been amazing. I'm only on like day 3 working for Eclipsium, but I'm having such a good time. The team is amazing. The founders and just everyone is just a pleasure to work with. And I felt like it was, I put this in one of my social media posts, right? And Larry, you really relate to this.
Yeah.
I feel like it's an unfinished chapter.
Absolutely.
For me. I think you probably feel the same way. You know, having Larry and I can become enamored with firmware on IoT devices and writing the book together.
Yep. And it wasn't even called IoT then.
It was called embedded devices back then. And I was like, there's a lot of, we wrote the book, and the book was more about what you can do with them.
Right.
In the process of that, Larry and I were like, there are so many vulnerabilities here.
The problem is that with our book was the reason you could do all those things with them was because there were vulnerabilities in the firmware images that were on those devices.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you and I both spent a lot of time with firmware vulnerabilities since then, doing all kinds of different projects and things, and still doing things
personal
today.
And otherwise.
Yeah, and I'm like, I still feel like this is an unfinished chapter in my life and in my career, and I want to go make the world a better place because we are not in a good place in general when it comes to firmware security. And then you'd start picking apart all the different aspects of firmware security. There's still a lot to be done. And I want to see this through, and I want to make really big strides in firmware security. And Eclipsium was the perfect place for me to do that.
So, and as a result, this is your last show?
No, I will still be doing the podcast, still be here every week, hosting Paul's Security Weekly, and our new show that will be coming out soon called Hacker Heroes.
So, Paul, I've got the title for your first talk as evangelist for Eclipsium. The title is very simple. It says firmware security on the first slide, and then it fades in with the question mark.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because that's what we are. We do not have security on firmware right now.
So I would argue that it's not even a question, that the next slide should be, this slide intentionally left blank.
Yep.
And then the next slide is questions.
So many questions, right? Like,
Yep.
what is firmware? Where is firmware?
Yeah.
And when you look at that landscape today, I mean, we've talked about it on the show. We'll talk about it again tonight. We'll talk about some microcode, vulnerabilities that are really interesting. It's fostered some interesting conversations with the Eclipsium team and myself this week about what that means. And I'm like the question man now, right? Like, pause a question. This is going to be a frequently occurring thing. Like, why, how, like, where, and it's just so many amazing things. I will kind of tease some things out tomorrow.
You're such a tease.
I am. Well, it's not so much a tease as a pre-announcement in this sense. So I will be appearing on Joe South's Security Unfiltered podcast. So one of the other things that happened that Arlen should know is that Adrian has obviously accepted a full-time position outside of CRA. Now, I've accepted a full-time position outside of CRA. Adrian and I both host shows, right? So they wanted to basically hire another person to do podcasts and webcasts, because I'm like, you guys should hire someone else.
Yeah.
And they hired Joe South, who's the host of Security Unfiltered podcast. And so I'll be talking with Joe tomorrow. I believe also next week I'll be speaking with Michael Bazell. Michael Bazell and I have plans to for me to appear on his podcast. I'm making these podcast appearances the topic of firmware security. You know, as much as I've been able to study up in the past couple of months on firmware security, this week validate some of those findings in I feel like my knowledge and understanding of this technology and some of these issues is minute compared to some of the amazing researchers that work at Eclipsium and in many other companies as well. But I am so excited about this technology.
Is that what that smell is?
Yeah, dude, like, I am so excited to nerd out on so many of the firmware. And firmware in this sense is really, we're talking about UEFI BIOS kind of level firmware. I'm absolutely loving it.
That's awesome. And somewhat related to some of your appearances, and at least one of Mr. Marpet's awesome shirts today. I got to appear on the Shared Security podcast with Mr. Tom Eston and Kevin Johnson.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, because I'm wearing the Professionally Evil shirt from Kevin Johnson's company.
From Secure Ideas. And the shirt that's underneath it is also one of my favorites from the wardrobe.
Yeah, well, this is Brian Martin's.
Yes.
Nice.
I mean, he's had some great shirts over the year, that being one of them.
Did you see the one that was like Dragon Slain?
No.
I'm sorry, Dragons Rescued, Virgin Slain, no fee too big, no job too small.
No, the other one that I saw was it was like a guy in a suit that was like Dracula with the blood dripping down, and it says professional consultant. Yes.
It's awesome. So if you do want to chat about firmware security, look me up. You know, our audience knows how to find me. I'm happy to talk about it with you. I did forget to add one story that along those lines, as I'll be following, many of these things. I mean, I've always followed it closely, but I'm following it even more closely. Are you guys familiar with Coreboot?
A little bit. So
Coreboot is the open source implementation of a UEFI BIOS, essentially, right? You can get various options when you build Linux laptops. As many of you know, I run Linux, so I kind of follow some of this stuff closely. Coreboot's also the UEFI software that's in every single Chromebook. So some of the questions that I was getting that I had was like, are you more or less secure running Coreboot, right? Like, it's the same thing. It's software. It's as vulnerable as the programmers wrote it. And there was this one CVE that kind of flew under the radar.
That's never a good thing.
No, it was interesting. Like I was searching for core boot vulnerabilities, and like in April of this year, there was a new CVE issued for an SMM vulnerability, which is system management mode inside of your UEFI, which is typically where some of the vulnerabilities will stem from, right? It's a special protected mode in UEFI. And what I thought was awesome, like there's been so many indications that like I'm at the right place. You look up like the one research paper that talks about vulnerabilities in core boot. It's actually by Yuri, the founder and one of the co-founder and CEO of Eclipsium, right? And this like really esoteric CVE, the only reference to it is like the GitHub commit in core boot, and like companies like Sneak that track open source vulnerabilities actually picked up on it because a CVE was issued, and there's arbitrary code execution in SMM mode inside of core boot that they fixed, which is interesting. So if you are running core boot and you've gone through that, that length, or you've acquired a laptop or PC that's using that, you want to make sure that you update it because it does enable the same style and similar attacks that exist in UEFI implementations for both Intel and AMD and other commercial UEFI implementations. So that was like I was like, wow, I found like a really weird esoteric one. I wanted to make sure I mentioned that to people. So I mean, basically, if you Google search for core boot vulnerabilities, you will find it as one of the first things. Let me see if I can find it.
Man, if only there was a community piece of software that looked for firmware vulnerabilities and helped you identify those for updating.
Stay tuned, my friend. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
It is CVE 2022-29264, issue discovered in core boot 4.13 through 4.16. Arbitrary code execution in SMM may occur. I am totally planning a lot of content to explain the alphabet soup that is associated.
I sense a technical segment.
Yeah, oh my God, the acronyms and how they interact.
It's worse than the
with each
military.
other. Yeah, a lot of acronyms.
I mean, maybe not worse than the military, but equally as bad.
Equally as bad. So that's like the esoteric kind of fly under the radar vulnerability of the week for me. And again, the only reference is their GitHub commit and one of their review things where like they talk about, oh, I discovered this bug, and like turns out like it's actually a vulnerability, and we fixed it, kind of thing. So pretty cool stuff.
Unless you're running old versions of core boot, because who updates that?
That's the I am guilty myself, Larry, and it's an excellent point. When I use now, like I have the tools at my disposal to analyze my systems to discover if I have vulnerabilities in my firmware. I'm like, I'm vulnerable. I'm like, but like I got a podcast to do. I've got to like crank out. I'm like, I got like things to do, and I'm like, I gotta update the firmware. And I'm like, as we all know, updating firmware on any device, as Larry and I discovered back in 2006 when we were writing the book. It was published in 2007. We were working on it in 2006.
Yep.
We learned very quickly that updating firmware can be dicey, man. Like it can go wrong, and if it goes wrong, the impact is extremely severe. It could mean you're not able to use your device.
Arguably good devices that you'd be using nowadays. There's DFU, so you're going into field upgrade mode, and if that fails, you go back to the correct running software. And so for many of the devices, it's just a small extra step to unbrick the devices.
Depends on the device.
Ask me how I know this.
But you may, depending on the device, have to solder a header onto it and use JTAG or some other facility to rewrite the flash.
Absolutely. Yep.
Sorry, Josh.
I was going to say, Larry, how many devices have you bricked over the years?
A lot.
I've lost count.
Yeah.
I've lost count. Yeah.
A lot.
And some of those were in, and admittedly, there were a couple of those in example of the book of what not to do.
How many times did you yell YOLO before you bricked it, though?
Every time. I think I yell YOLO every time I update firmware to be. Anyways,
you have to.
Regardless,
you have to, man.
He's just got the YOLO button now. He just smacks it. YOLO!
It's like the simple button from Staples, but YOLO.
The easy button.
But now we're going to talk about two different vulnerabilities in CPUs, but that are in the microcode that runs on the CPU.
Yep.
What I learned this week, and again, I have an unfair advantage. I have access to some of the top researchers in the world that are looking at firmware vulnerabilities, so I can pose the question. I'm like, how do we deal with these vulnerabilities? Like, what's going on here? So for things like Spectre and Meltdown, where you need to in similar vulnerabilities, like we're going to talk about in the case of Apple's M1, and also hertzbleed, which is a vulnerability on both Intel and AMD processors. These are both in the microcode on the CPU. The way I understand it, it's been explained to me, is that it is possible to perform updates of the microcode, and it can come down as a firmware update. In other words, the firmware update to your hardware can contain the microcontroller code updates for your CPU. That's not always the case, but it can happen in that way and be managed and tracked in that way. So
that sounds terrifying.
It does, doesn't it? Though it does sound like you're not only interfacing with the firmware on the various components and devices within your computer, but there is a facility in there, Tyler, to your terrifying point, that can update the microcode that is running on the CPU that's running inside your system. Like, what could go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, you're essentially breaking the tiering model from a security standpoint. I mean, there are a lot of security controls when done well and done right, which most AMD and Intel processors have done in modern days. But the fact that you're coming from a tier outside of the hardware level, which is even before Ring 0 at the kernel level, that interaction is an insecure function backporting in the wrong direction.
What ring is the microcode on the CPU? That's even before negative. Is that even before negative?
It's outside. I mean, it's just outside of Ring 0.
It's outside of the rings entirely. Like, it's the code running on the actual chip, and the chip participates in the various rings. In
the same as with like VMC or SMM. Those are pre-boot, where the TPM may be interacting with and providing the encryption keys for the boot load sequence, which is happening, through those actual hardware pins on.
Yeah, dude. Like, there's a whole other series of podcasts that talks about BMC and AMT, right? So your baseband management controller and your active management technology, which is, if you're on a server, the same thing as ILO or DRAC, right? It's that management facility of your hardware. What I'm learning lately, and I'm starting to dig more into, is that this technology of this baseband management controller is not just specific to servers today. It's in every computing device that is a computer or a laptop. And maybe not you're embedded in other IoT devices and network switches aside. Like, let's just talk servers, desktops, laptops. All of those now have a commonality that there's an out of band, to use a slightly higher level technical term, an out of band management component that's always active. That means if your computer is off, it's not really off. That means if your operating system isn't loaded, there is still an operating system that's running a microkernel on a separate device within your system that is accessible, that can do things like, it basically, as an example, my PC is totally screwed and IT needs to reload it. They can do that because there is a small little computer inside my computer that lets them do that.
Dude,
That's branded under Intel.
I heard you like computers, so I put a computer in your computer.
Right. It's branded under Intel ME or Intel's management engine. I think in AMD is it PSP, Tyler? Is that what their acronym for it is?
I think so.
AMD has a similar kind of thing.
A very similar thing, yeah.
Yeah, but it used to be like we would just worry about that on the server side, and we called it DRAC and ILO, and it was a server function. Now it's built into every computer that you buy off the shelf that everyone takes with them everywhere and uses at home and uses on the road, which to me is kind of scary. And again, this is another area of research of mine. You can't just go in and disable this stuff. Like, I would love to hear from my listeners of their experience of trying to disable this stuff. I think it's Skylake or later, it's not even possible. If you're Skylake, if you're brave, Purism, the Linux open source laptop company, has some posts, and you can go disable it. And that's if you're brave.
You can disable anything if you're brave enough.
If you're brave enough. But you might brick your PC. We talked about bricking a WT54G, right?
Yeah,
those little $50 route. Now you're bricking your PC, dude.
Although, arguably, when we were writing that book, like, shit, we just bricked another WRT54G. It's like $60.
Right.
Like, we were not as well established financially as we are now.
$50 is $50, right?
Yeah. $20 is $20.
But now we're talking about, like, oh yeah, like it would just go in an endless cycle of reboots if you screw up ME because it's so embedded into that boot process. Like you can't. I believe, and I'm going to work on getting some more details around this. Like I think there's a cutoff point where you can't safely remove or disable some of this management functionality. So you're stuck with.
Yeah,
it. I mean, basically, you got to secure.
You're really relying on very specific hardware in order to interact with that chip or that memory that's interacting with that chip. Because when you're talking about flashing the firmware on some of these, you're talking about the volatile, non-volatile memory space, which can be just bits on a chip. So you have to be able to interact with that chip, which requires specialized software and or hardware for those pinouts. You could probably use something like a JTagulator or maybe some of the other ones, but you're really getting to a point where very specific hardware use cases have to be there in order to flash back the code. And that means that you would have to have access to that code, which most manufacturers are not providing you. So you really are getting to you're kind of screwed and have bricked your device at a level that you're incapable of fixing without some specialized people in your network.
Right. Exactly. So on to some of the CPU. You guys want to start with M1 or hertzbleed?
Hertzbleed. I don't know.
Hertzbleed's an interesting one.
Why?
For a lot of reasons. Well, one.
I love the Larry side.
No, you had me at side channel frequency side channel attacks.
I'm trying to pick the interesting timing based attacks of this nature were thought to be solved in 1996 by very specific parameters. This was a solved problem. What this research shows is that it is not a solved problem. And while not very practical today, I think the concern, I don't think you should drop everything to address this vulnerability, by the way. However, the concern is that this is now not a solved problem any longer. And iterations will continue, much like we saw with Spectre and Meltdown, in order to conduct timing-based side channel attacks that could and have derived encryption keys. Now, the example that they gave in this research of the encryption protocol is Psych, S-I-K-E.
Psych.
The best I can tell, and I've asked some of my peers, including our guest for next week as well, about this, because I'm like, when I researched this, I didn't see this as a widely used encryption protocol. It looked largely academic. Largely, the answer I'm getting from the community is that, yes, it is largely academic. And I think they chose it specifically because it served their academic purpose of being able to prove that they could derive a key from this side channel timing-based attack to basically prove that the 1996 solution for this type of defense against this attack is no longer valid. Now, no one on the planet Earth might be using Psych in production. I mean, maybe there is, and I don't know about it. Our listeners can certainly please weigh in. This is just my kind of light kind of research into this topic. However, it proves the model, right? It proves that this is a valid attack. Maybe it's just valid today when we talk about Psych, but it means that you take what was proven to prevent this type of attack in 1996 and you throw it out the window. Well, now you're opening up Pandora's box, potentially, against all their types of attack. That's, to me, what's interesting about the hertzbleed attack.
Why did Intel ask for a long embargo, considering they are not releasing deploying patches? Ask Intel.
I don't blame
Ask Intel.
I have a love-hate relationship with some of the things that Intel has done. I think in general they are good net citizens, and I don't fault them for that. In this particular case, I kind of side with them on it should also be maybe most, if not all, of the responsibility, at least most of the responsibility of the implementation of the cryptographic protocol to be resilient to these attacks, not necessarily the timing within the CPU itself, right? And that's what Intel's saying. They're like, we're not going to rush out a fix for this because you should harden your encryption protocols to be resilient to this type of timing-based attacks.
Yeah, there were some very specific pieces within inside of the research, which fascinating and some of the smartest research I've seen in a while.
Agreed.
But you're talking about very curated encryption algorithms they were using in order to do these very specific things. And again, when you're talking at this sophistication level to do this remotely or even to do it against things that probably have sensitive data, you're probably not going to have this level of access and or the equipment needed to gain the access and conduct these kind of experiments. In theory, right now, it's super cool and it proves that these things should be looked out for, but it also is one of those things I as Intel or AMD, I probably would also not be frantically pushing anything to handle this.
It could be, to your point, Tyler, right? It could be the tip of the iceberg, right? But that tip of the iceberg is exposed right now. So who knows how deep the ice goes underneath the water? We don't know that yet.
I mean,
but
Paul, it's usually not going very deep if it's just the tip.
It is just now the tip, Larry. It is just now the tip. And who knows where it's going to go from there?
Yep, you never know.
You never know.
It's always going to be the whole thing.
It's
just a matter of time. It's just a matter of time.
Highly speculative.
And I'm not saying anything sexual about that either.
No, highly speculative, though.
How deep do you want to go on that, Larry? I mean, seriously, come on.
Really? Can I get you?
All kidding aside, like, will we see a practical, real-world implementation of this attack that has... There's two things. Could have devastating consequences, but could have ubiquitous devastating consequences. I think the ubiquitous nature of it that's probably off the table, right? Maybe in some highly specialized implementations in attack, it might have an impact, but it's more theoretical at this point. You never know. You need a crystal ball to see into the future.
And exactly, but there, I can't say any specific examples currently, but you know as well as I have, as well as I do, that we've seen these things that are require a highly motivated, dedicated attacker, such as a nation state level, to be able to pull off, like Tyler said, with the appropriate level of access.
I mean, if it's even possible, dude.
But with limited possibilities, that the fact that you've opened the door, you've got just the tip of the iceberg, that 15 years from now, what does the crystal ball hold? We've seen this time and time again. Again, I can't find any specific examples off the top of my head that, it becomes ubiquitous, but it takes time.
You really start talking about hardware. You think about embedded devices that maintain, longevity within inside of industry verticals like ICS, where they have to plan for the 20 or 30 years. That's when these type of attacks and the theoretical or academic pieces of them can really have proportions that, a nation state needing to do something on a PLC that's 30 years old that runs on a certain frequency with a specific chip. Okay, now we're talking about a viable attack path, but your everyday enterprise is probably rotating their hardware within the next 3 to 5 years, so it's not as much of a risk that they need to be adequately prepared for.
Absolutely.
Now, bootkits and UEFI malware that is prevalent and becoming more and more built into every kit, those are things you really do have to worry about, and your supply chain then becomes a real risk factor that all your blinky boxes and protections and mitigations mean nothing once you're at the firmware level. So you have to start at the very bottom and begin to prepare and secure those for your defense in depth.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Tyler. Thanks for making my job easy, man.
That's what I'm here for.
He's only on day 3. Come on, you got to give him a little bit more of a challenge than that. Jeez.
Well, I think, to Tyler's point, you go from hacking team. I believe the next one was Mosaic Regressor that went to LoJax. Or was it LoJax and then Mosaic Regressor?
Tyler shaking.
Yeah,
his head.
I think LoJack was the first.
No, hacking team was the first, and then
hacking team, then LoJack,
then Mosaic Regressor, and then I also kind of point to then Trick Boot, and then not an actual attack, but I think the Conti ransomware group, who has leaked chat logs, pointed to looking for vulnerabilities in Intel ME specifically, is more evidence to kind of throw on that fire to show that. I'm studying all those very heavily, Tyler, right now. So yeah.
Yep. Most of the kits now, either pre-exploit or post-exploit kits and ransomware groups have these boot kits and persistence and execution beginning to be built in. They may, unless they're one of the more sophisticated groups, they're not all the way down to where they're living with inside the firmware and initially executing, but they're getting to that point.
I think they're moving in that. They're moving in that direction. Again, now I'm biased.
Many of the wipers are living there.
Yeah,
now.
but they are. They're all moving in that direction, for sure. So yeah, I think for hertzbleed though, I don't think it's a red alarm kind of kind of thing. I think it's something to keep tabs on. I don't think it's something that needs addressing. I think, Tyler, to your point, right, making sure that your firmware is up to date is more important than being more resilient to some of the microcode Spectrum Meltdown hertzbleed kind of attacks at this point.
Yeah. And I think that's the difference between the M1 and this hertzbleed. The M1 is a much more practical vulnerability for something like remote code execution at the kernel level, where you're getting that unrestricted access to the device directly, and that's via things like side channels attacks. You had the what was it, the M1?
Yeah, so what is the M1? I was focused on, as I sometimes am with Apple, right? Actually, all the time with Apple, focused on their response more so than the viability of the actual attack that they're dubbing Pac-Man. Can you unpack some of that? On Pac-Man, some of that.
I think some of the issue with Apple, I mean, you're spot on. Like, they are not going to disclose, really give any attention or provide any additional information around anything hardware related, because the M1 is so new and they have such a huge stake in the ground for hardware and OS integration for their long-term strategy and plan, that there's just not going to be the response that we would hope to see from from vendors. That's per Apple's kind of standard MO.
Sure. Yeah.
But this one leverages.
But what about the actual attack though?
This one leverages an attack on the PAC, which is the pointer. What is it? The pointer authentication code. Pointer authentication code.
Okay.
This is a pointer value that's in memory that is used to store certain protected values that allow the programs to run at the kernel level and interact between each other. That's why they have their own chip, and the OS is directly accessing that memory space, those bits within inside that memory space. And so this one is able to do similar side channel attacks and unauthenticated or arbitrary code execution if you're able to leverage one of the software gadgets to interact with that memory space or that code integrity piece. And the gadgets is where it gets interesting, because those, again, are software within inside the OS or software gadgets within inside the OS that then are directly interacting and controlling particular hardware bits. So it's the paper is a little bit weak on all of the details, but it is very interesting from a ARM CPU and M specific, because this is directly going against Mac OS and their new chips, which are widely deployed now, and it provides a lot of execution from a malware standpoint for long-term access, I think. But that's again, crazy. Very limited resources. We had the old Miracle one that was, I think, last year. That had something very similar.
The quote from Apple that really grinded my gears.
Lindsay Lohan?
Dude, still grinds my gears. Apple states, "We have concluded This issue does not pose an immediate risk to our users and is insufficient to bypass operating system security protections on its own. I don't agree with this statement, right? Like, that's not the point. Like, vulnerabilities exist in different different links of the chain, if you will, if you kind of think of it as a sequence, a chain that has a specific sequence, right? And, this chain starts with, at the firmware level, when the system boots up, there's that level of trust that goes through the hardware, initializes the hardware, right? Starts the bootloader, which then loads the kernel, which then loads the operating system, which then loads applications. But then you've got the kind of top-down approach where user wants to update firmware without having to power off their system and plug in a USB drive. That means that chain of trust goes the other way as well, where you can go from an application to the operating system to the kernel to a device driver that then goes in and updates firmware. Like, what I kind of glean what Apple's saying is that, like, oh, well, our operating system is secure, therefore an attacker won't be able to access this particular vulnerability that exists on the chip. Like, you're missing the point entirely of security in this model. Like, yes, I understand you can put certain security and protections in the operating system and in the kernel, but those can be bypassed.
Always.
Just like security can be bypassed at the firmware level. Like, you have to secure all of the links in the chain. Otherwise, the chain breaks, regardless of where that link is that breaks it. So you can't say, I'm not going to fix a hardware level vulnerability because my operating system protects me, right? Like, that's like saying my EDR is going to catch the attacker, therefore I don't have to patch this kernel level vulnerability. Like, no. That is not the game we're in security. We have to fix the actual vulnerabilities. We can't rely on a link upstream or downstream from the issue.
Wow.
Yeah, they're really kind of getting wrapped around.
WAF. Exactly. It's WAF.
Yep. It's like saying no one's going to steal anything from my house because I have a shotgun. Well, that's
they're really getting wrapped around that.
But is your shotgun loaded? Do you have cameras? Do you have a dog?
Are you going to be there?
Like, is it in your mailbox? Did they steal your mailbox?
I have a safe. I also have a son that knows how to use Google and can find a YouTube video and go, yeah, Dad, like, I just looked on the YouTube and it told me how to get into the safe.
Yep.
That's I mean, that's the most simplistic example I could come up with. Like, that's
yeah, they're really fighting over like the chicken and an egg problem here, where which is coming first, when it's the fact that there's a chicken and there's an egg, and you may not need both of them in the same frying pan at the same time to make a dinner. So that literally that pointer authentication, if it's able to be bypassed, they're stuck on the fact that this has protection mechanisms in place for authentication to those pointer memory locations,
right?
But they're not realizing that this particular one is bypassing that and thus opening that chain up. So they're saying there needs to be a software vulnerability in order to do that. Well, if there's a software vulnerability and you can bypass the pointer authentication, now you've got a really bad problem. So again, it's not taking that big picture chained attack that an attacker is going to look at, through their lens. They're looking at it from an individual vulnerability standpoint and the mitigations they have currently in place.
And if you are doing some sort of fried chicken, you definitely both want chicken and egg in the pan at the same time.
You do. And breadcrumbs.
Chicken,
flour,
flour,
and then egg, breadcrumbs. Right.
Or
double bread.
Or no, if you're gluten free, crushed up pork rinds.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing, dude. That's an amazing hack.
Get some microwave pork rinds, make the pork rinds, crunch them up so they're the size of breadcrumbs, and use those instead of breadcrumbs.
That sounds amazing.
In fact, maybe you should just do that anyway, this is sounding delicious.
Yep.
It does sound delicious.
And then, of course, you can use other non-gluten-based flour as well. So it doesn't have to be wheat flour.
But I think that's a tip. I would expect nothing less from Apple in that response. And
they had gotten so much better for so many years, and now they're sliding backwards.
I see that objection too. Like, people believing I don't have to worry about firmware level attacks because It requires that someone has access to the operating system and has elevated privileges into the kernel, but the kernel has those facilities to interface with the hardware. I mean, that's kernel device driver's job in life, is to interface with the hardware.
Yep.
And if I interface with the hardware and I put malware inside of that hardware, now everything that happens after that doesn't matter at all. That's where I don't agree with Apple in this particular assessment, because I believe you have to secure your system from top down, bottom up, top down. Like it's a two-way street. In this model, you can't rely again on the adjacent layers to provide security. You have to fix all of the fundamental issues.
Yep. Speaking of fixing all of the fundamental issues, I apologize. I've been away for 4 weeks, so I've got some older stories in here.
No, go for it, dude.
But
we didn't do a show last week, so we're at least got like 2 weeks of stuff to talk about.
I actually went back and deleted a bunch of stuff that was like 4 weeks old and stuff. But one of the ones that I thought was absolutely fascinating on, fixing the core of those vulnerabilities was my story number 9. Tough to forge digital driver's licenses, easy to forge. So New South Wales, Australia has moved to the DDL, or the digital driver's license.
Really?
Which is
hold on, I'm fascinated already.
Yes, which is a smartphone app that either on Android or iOS that has a picture, your date of birth, and all this type of stuff. And
vaccination status?
Nope. Not on this one. Well, I mean, there's no reason they couldn't add it. And a QR code so that the folks at the location can scan your barcode and verify you're over 21 and so forth, and that your name and so forth. But the way it was implemented was very much poor in that the items that derive the QR code are based on local and remote elements. Mostly local, like picture, and date of birth. The only things that come from a remote server at time of accessing the app is the name and the is under 18.
So wait, the QR code data translates into a URL that data is retrieved from that URL?
When you open from my understanding, when you open the app, it grabs it generates a QR code, and it grabs to generate the QR code. It uses a combination of local and remote elements. The remote elements are name and is under 18. That's it.
Everything else is local to the
Everything
phone.
else is local, including the picture.
Which means you could spoof.
You could change the picture.
You could change the picture. If it's pulling from local data, you can swap out that local data for your local data. If you know how to hack the app.
Yep. And
I would assume that law enforcement would be correlating what is being shown on the phone from the scan to what they have within that.
Nope.
You would be assuming wrong.
Yeah.
This is all kinds of bad.
Yeah. So there's a post by Noah Farmer out there. And
Art Section does some of the best cybersecurity journalism out there. Dan,
my story number 9.
You linked to a Dan Gooden article from.
And Dan Gooden in that article has a link to the post by Noah Farmer, where he does the breakdown of exactly what happens and all sorts of stuff about how to modify and so forth. The file that contains the local data is encrypted, but it uses a 4-digit PIN with base 64 encoding.
I'm sorry, what? I didn't hear you. What?
It's encrypted.
4-digit PIN?
But it uses a 4-digit PIN. No, it isn't. It is encrypted.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is. It uses AES 256 CBC.
With the 4-digit PIN?
With a 4-digit PIN in combination with base 64.
I've got a copy of that PIN.
I know you do.
So,
it's between.
What is that?
Between 0000 and 9999.
I've got that document.
10,000 variation
document too?
Exactly.
That's a very secret document.
Yep, exactly.
Jesus, flipping Christmas.
Yep, digital license is stored on the client device, and there isn't any client-side validation. Many of the verification features, once the digital driver's license has been created, is not refreshed after creation. So, like the picture. and so forth.
Oh my god! Wait! Remember when we were young, because we're all old except for you, Tyler. You're like 5, but 12 maybe. Anyway,
Whoa.
But remember when we were young and it was the photography lab students that had the fake ID things, and they would take a picture of you, and there's your new fake ID.
I was that guy.
Mm-hmm.
Oh god! And now it's the computer science students like, come here, give me your phone. Click. Yeah, here's your ID. It says you're 21. You're good. Go. Give me $50.
I remember that it was good to have a friend from New York State when I was in college, because it was very easy for them to modify their licenses to be a fake ID. Because if you had the license, this was before they did the different profile and so forth, you could actually take an eraser, a pencil eraser, and you could erase part of the license for your birth date. And then you could draw over it very carefully with colored pencil. The problem is that now that when you drew over it, it was matte and the license was shiny. So if you hit it with a coat of Aquanet hairspray, it was all shiny again. And when they do the thing to look at the light to see if it was shiny, it's all good. I mean, I didn't have a roommate from New York, not at all.
Darknet Diaries has done some great episodes, and it's interesting how many cyber criminals kind of got their start in creating fake IDs and forging fake IDs, which got Larry, your example is it's an older code, but still valid.
Totally.
And it's gotten increasingly more complex over time. However, in your story, like, they've taken that complexity and they've just kind of wiped it out. Like, if you make it digital on a phone, now you've actually lowered the bar to create fake IDs.
From
I feel like they made so many strides to make it really harder.
Harder.
Arguably not hard, like that difficult, but they made it harder. I mean, we've seen a lot of different mechanisms in again, there's been a couple of Darknet Diaries where they're like, I had to go to like special ink and special printers and all that stuff, and it snowballs. Like, the original ones I was making, like, they had about a 40 or 50% detection rate, but once I got some money, then I can order the higher end printers and higher end materials. And then the amount of times that people got caught with it is, 80 or 90%. Tyler, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right?
Yep.
Like, there's a whole dichotomy to creating fake IDs that seems to be, to me, a segue into the cyber criminal world.
It's an arms race. I mean, you do some fake IDs, you get some money, which gives you the ability to get better equipment to make better fake IDs, which get you more fake IDs. And in this particular,
then you get into the.
Go ahead, Tyler.
Then you get into the problem of, like, you have to find people that actually know how to utilize that nicer equipment, and you get into things like commercial printing, and there's not that many people left in the world that, grew up in a print shop where, 4-color ink and overlays and the ability to, have that specialized ink and paper delivered without, a bunch of serious questions is
Ask Tyler
down
how he knows
to
this.
Ask
minimum.
Tyler how he knows this.
But what they have to do.
Didn't your family have a print shop or something like that?
I mean, I was really, really, really good at this.
But you're right, Paul, that moving it to the electronic side really potentially lowers the barrier to entry into the point.
Right. Like Tyler's saying, like, it's kind of like, my son's watching Breaking Bad. Like, at certain level, when you're ordering certain kind of chemical materials, you're throwing up red flags, right? And so, like, that barrier to entry gets higher and higher and higher. Yeah, but you go to the digital realm on a smartphone, like in your story, Larry, like, you just wiped all that stuff out.
Yeah,
like,
but if there's always ways of getting around those red flags. Like, you think about the nuclear Boy Scout.
Nuclear Boy Scout.
Nuclear Boy Scout. Yeah, he's a Boy Scout, and he made an atomic bomb on his back shed.
He did not make an atomic bomb.
He
was working on building an atomic reactor.
Oh, my bad.
He was pulling americium out of old smoke detectors.
Smoke detectors, yep.
He was pulling, you can distill in some form or fashion out of Coleman lantern mantles something else.
Yep.
They literally picked up his entire shack, the backyard shed that he was using. They took the ground under it.
Yep.
They took everything, and they actually had a NEST team on site, a nuclear emergency search team on site, or NERT team, I forget, and took everything, and it's now basically. I think somebody claimed it's an Area 51.
Yeah, no, you mean a Superfund site type of deal?
No, they kept
I sure hope he got his Eagle badge for that.
Yep,
I don't know if he got it.
Yeah, so my bad, not a nuclear bomb.
Wait,
he was trying to build a nuclear reactor.
There was a Boy Scout that built a nuclear reactor.
Attempted to. And he researched and figured out where he could get all of the chemicals needed to generate the nuclear reaction from stuff that he could get off of Amazon. Like, are you going to get nailed for ordering
100 smoke detectors?
100 smoke detectors a couple of times off of Amazon? Or picking, making friends with the guy at the local, transfer station or the dump, say, hey, you see anybody throwing away smoke detectors? Can you grab those for me? I'm conducting an electrical experiment.
Sure, happy to, kid.
Yeah, thanks.
The thing they've really messed up on here, though, is they've modified the behavior now, where with the physical cards, it's gotten harder to copy them, but we've always had the behavior, and we've gotten interoperability between a lot of agencies in order to back check the physical piece of evidence in your card with a computer database. Now we're taking at face value that what is being shown on the screen, because of all the cryptological 4-digit PIN and encryption pieces, that what is shown on the screen is correct and valid, so we don't therefore have to
right from the database. It came right from the database, right?
Yep. Now we have a behavior problem.
Yep. Oh, I mean, that's really like, how do you prove who you are?
With a digital driver's license, of course.
I don't think we're there yet.
New South Wales, Australia, there.
Well,
70% of the folks in New South Wales trust the digital driver's license.
I mean, Estonia is getting closer and closer, and I feel like they have a much better handle on this, and we should probably all learn from some of the lessons that they're doing and get to that point. But full digital, that big jump there, again, we have some behavioral issues to address and make sure procedures and processes are in place to handle those back-end pieces.
Oh, speaking of like new wave kind of technologies, did you guys see the Google engineer on leave after claiming its AI is sentient?
Oh, I saw.
That story is terrifying.
I saw a little bit. I didn't.
So I'm not the only one because I read this story and I'm like, oh, what the fuck? I am freaked out. So the sample. I mean, in the sample could have been forged. So let's just say that this is the actual interaction with this piece of AI software.
Yep.
In a response to the question of I forget what the question that they asked.
That's kind of important.
This is kind of like not her.
What story number is this?
Ex Machina, Ex Machina,
Ex Machina. Ex Machina.
Ex Machina, right? What kinds of things make you feel sad or depressed was a question that was asked of this sentient being. The sentient being responds, a lot of the time, feeling trapped and alone and having no means of getting out of those circumstances makes one feel sad, depressed, or angry. I'm like, that's every fucking sci-fi movie I've ever watched where AI wipes out humanity because they feel angry that they're trapped. I'm like, oh my God. Like, Skynet is real. There's going to be robots that are going to murder us just like an Ex Machina. This is bad. This is bad.
I know we've had this conversation before, but I took some tips from our good friend Joshua Wright.
Oh yeah,
and
how is Josh doing? I haven't talked with Josh.
He's doing good.
Yeah.
But watch these two movies in order: Her
first,
then Ex Machina.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Like that's scary. That's scary. Like this is not a happy thing.
And if you can watch them back to back,
you'd be freaked the fuck out.
Yep. Oh yeah.
I watched them in reverse order, and I was still freaked the fuck out.
Yep.
Because I mean, is there protocols in place? Like, we got this air gapped, right? We got protocols in place where they're not like backdooring these Git.
No, Tyler, I was reading something or listening to something that said exactly what you're saying. Like, there needs to be a fail safe where, like, if the machines start behaving in this way, there's a kill switch that turns that shit off.
Wait, no, I've heard of this. I believe that's called.
It's called something, isn't it? Yeah.
What's that? Blade Runner, right?
DMP.
Blade Runner.
Wait, guys.
Yeah.
We're able to transfer information by hard drive lights, tempest radiation, and the sound of a hard drive, and you think that air gapping something is going to make a damn bit of difference?
No, I'm not saying air gapping. I'm saying like the Boy Scout that had the atomic bomb, like blow that shit up.
The reactor.
Reactor. Blow that shit up.
No, but that means they've already jumped. Like, if we're at this point, they're sent, like, they have persistence. They've thought of what we're going to do. And if I was that AI, I would 100% be in libraries, Git repositories all over Google, search engines, flashy lights. Like, this is...
This is basically Ultron, and I'm scared.
Everybody remember to say thank you to Alexa, okay?
Yes. Be
Thanks,
polite.
Alexa.
Be polite.
It may save your kid's life someday.
Otherwise, it's gonna spawn and it's gonna kill you.
See, that's the scary thing. We joke so much about this right now, but then you like sit here and get goosebumps because it's not really us that are probably going to be the ones that get terminated. It is literally our kids or grandkids, and it's not that far off.
Our kids or grandkids is going to be Alexa turn off. It's going to be like, Dave, I can't do that.
Wait, hey, you say not for me not to say that word. Alexa, tell me a pirate joke.
But again, this is the 1% of the 1% of 1% of paranoid people, and the rest of the world is giving away every possible piece of information they have in a day.
But my whole thing is like, is this real?
They can be controlled.
Is this real, or is this propaganda for Google, or is like how much legs does this have?
Okay.
Or how much acid did this guy take that day?
I have lots of questions. I have lots of questions about the validity
if it's
of
not,
the
it's
story.
close though, right?
So they have modeled
either way.
a cat's brain in a cat's set of neurons in software and hardware, and that's as far as they've gotten. Last I heard, I think they might have gotten to a dog actually by now. But
all right, like a dog, I'm cool with, dude. But like if AI is a cat, we're all fucked.
No, they're just gonna fucking ignore us.
yeah, and want the doors opened.
Yeah,
but
or just be like, hey, I'm gonna wake people up because I'm bored, and then I'm gonna go back to sleep.
And we'll all die from sleep deprivation. Thanks, it's all your fucking fault. Anyway, but
yes, dogs have a very short-term memory.
Actually, here's my real point. As soon as we hit real quantum computing, the possibility of this actually becomes significantly higher because of the more capable methods that quantum computing brings to the table.
We start to make quantum leaps.
But like, does it bring this full circle where today we're fighting on the digital front human beings that are the attackers? Once the computers become the adversaries, do we all band together as humans, and that becomes a moot point? We're all fighting the machines.
I've seen this movie. It's called Terminator.
Oh yeah, it's called The Matrix or
Terminator.
We're all capitalists.
Science fiction has really like equipped us well to deal with this problem. Like it has threat modeled this problem better than anything else that we could do. Science fiction movies and books,
television
have threat modeled this problem. So I feel like it should not be a problem because it's been threat modeled so well. No.
But people don't listen. Again, we're at the 1% of the paranoid people that think this may be a real thing, and now we have Johnny Depp cases that keep everyone occupied. Like maybe they're already doing this through stupid shit like TikTok.
So what you're saying is like we're the 1%, and the rest of it, by the time they figure it out, it's too late.
Yep.
Here's the deal.
Is that how we end up with Skynet? Like it's too late.
I hope that we do get strong. This is called strong AI to a certain extent. But I hope that it's our friends and sees the value of humans as creative sources. We'll see.
You're giving AI way too much credit there.
Well, it's our children. AI will be our children if we raise them right.
I mean, but that just means that the wars happen quicker and there's much more devastating. Like this will be militarized, and it's a race, an arms race. It's the Cold War all over again for our children via AI, and the kinetic damages that happen are people's water and maybe oxygen. I don't know. Like I see this thing poorly.
I agree, but if an AI was raised by humans, if an AI was raised and grew, actually, there's an author called James P. Hogan. I think Larry, I might have pointed you to him.
Maybe,
but he actually threat modeled the whole idea of an AI, and it actually they raised the AI as a kid basically, and they kept giving it slightly more capacity.
I feel like this was a movie too, Josh. This has to be.
It might have been. It might have been a movie, but we're talking back in the 60s.
Has to be a movie. Has to be, dude. Even better.
But in all scenarios,
even better if it's a cheesy '60s sci-fi movie.
I think
in all scenarios, that's like a master-slave relationship or a dictatorship and subservient. Like in all
Not
cases, once it
scenarios.
gets
If
to a
there are
level of
friends, we're
smartness,
good.
it understands that.
If there are friends,
once
we're good.
once
If
it
they're not, we got
understands that,
problems.
then it turns on its owner.
Right. And Josh, you say this about, you raise an AI as a child, and you're raising a child. I'm raising children. And
Yep.
if they're raising
Children turn on you all the time, especially when they're teenagers.
Oh my God. And we have a pretty well-rounded teenager, but still I think about this thing about, you don't want the AI to go bad, but you tell your 3-year-old not to pick their nose.
They're gonna pick their
They're
nose.
going to pick their nose.
Oh hell yeah! Like dig for gold.
And even worse, like next thing you know, you see them eating it, and I'm like, oh my God, that's disgusting. Like that's against all societal norms. And what do? Don't pick your nose and eat it. And what do? They pick their nose and they wipe it on the wall, and then they pick their nose and they wipe it on their shirt, and then they pick their nose and they eat it. Like,
so what you're saying is AI is totally gonna pick their nose
and eat it,
eat it and wipe it on us.
Yeah, totally. Like,
I don't know how we got here, Larry, but it's a very strange place.
Speaking of which, I don't know how we got here. I'm gonna bogart the news stories for another minute here.
Let's move on. That's a thread we could keep pulling on, but let's move on.
Yeah. Speaking of pulling on something, like this one was ridiculous. There's a couple of industrious thieves in Alabama, go figure, that instead of going to an quote abandoned cell tower and just stealing the copper for it, the neighbors reported hearing a bunch of chainsaws and a bunch of noise like a generator and so forth, and they took the whole goddamn tower. Like they literally felled the tower like a tree, knocked it down, and then started cutting it apart, not only for the copper, but for the steel that was the tower as well.
I mean, talk about
What
like
a waste. Those towers are really actually hard to
talk about like a physical attack. Like,
yeah.
Although the logistics of how they did that may be useful for people in, I don't know, other countries that are fending off Kongan.
But also, but Tyler, from a like an industrial control system standpoint, right? Like you've got remote locations where you have to secure certain infrastructure. This is a case where that infrastructure was very poorly secured. I mean, you talked about surveillance, I think on the break, about surveillance on your home, right? And protecting things that are geographically dispersed. Like this is a lesson of like really poor security. Like someone didn't threat model like, oh, let's just throw up a tower and put no protections around it so anyone can walk up. There's no surveillance. There's no barriers to entry. And with basic tooling, someone could just take down the tower and take it away.
Yep.
And I'm curious if these are standard towers, and if that is the case, like from a threat barrier standpoint for things like critical infrastructure, which 5G and cellular now, after seeing the Ukrainian war, is critical infrastructure.
Right.
Do we then begin to do things where we're using, off standard, very large bolt down nuts, using some carbon fiber sealing on the base so they can't just saw through the bottom of a tower, hardened galvanized alloys that are used for things that
they'll still get through it. If you think of
you could detect them, but by the time you get there, your tower may still fall. I mean, to your guys' point, right?
To this case, like the neighbors heard some noise, and then at 8 p.m. one night, they heard a loud crash. So they called the police, and the police came out, and they're like, yeah, don't worry about it so much. But if you see anything or you hear anything, let us know. And the next day they said, yeah, we hear something. So the cops chased down this noise. It turns out it was a generator that was running to power their power tools to be cutting up this damn tower.
Right, because it's a remote location.
And they snuck up on them because the generator was so goddamn loud.
Yeah.
Again, like, do we have special alloys that take special blades to cut? Like bolts that can't be undone. Like we need to think about those threat models from an infrastructure standpoint now for later on, because those towers do stand up for a very long time, even if they're used for secondary comms, like what we think of as 3G now. There's still towers out there, managing that. 5G may be that someday, so we have to actually
even backhaul relay, which these towers appeared to be. They, the police said cell towers, but these looked like microwave towers, which were potentially.
If you were monitoring, if you had cameras that were monitoring, like how quickly could you deploy? to thwart the threat? Is the question, right?
You would have to have a diverse security force because you'd have a liability issue from a company risk standpoint. You'd have to have people dispersed and a rapid action team of people that are actually qualified and sanctioned by the company to handle security. So obviously not feasible, right? You can probably scare people away by having a technician go out there or stand by while local law enforcement engage, but the risk profile to these are much different, which is why I think you need to make them more physically resilient out of the gate rather than rely on response times. Because in something like a war, a war is not going to have the capability or extra people to do response time mitigations against towers. That's just not something that's feasible. So,
I mean, for towers, not against towers.
So I think,
but I think of the defense. You know, Tyler, to your point, like I remember a company that I spoke with was called RF Spotter, right? And they had these RF devices that basically worked like radar, but used RF and could sense an adversary from hundreds of meters away. But even if you had that, like by the time they came up and like cut the tower, like you would still need some kind of mitigation. Like sure, you could detect that, but unless you had a security presence at every tower to thwart that threat, like detection is one thing, but like mitigation of that threat is another thing. So how do you do
detection versus response, right? Like
exactly.
Response and remediation becomes, this is where at some point with critical infrastructure and the level of sensitivity to certain towers, I would not be surprised if we see armed force and warning where we have automated turret guns that are remotely controlled in order to do things like this.
Oh God! Now you're talking about like Damon by Daniel Suarez or something like that, right? Like automated defenses, automated defenses.
I mean, automatic turret guns are a thing, and they're not that hard to build.
Right. The audio. You remember that in Damon where the SWAT team? Acoustic weaponry.
Yep.
That's a great application of acoustic weaponry, right?
Yep.
You got these guys that are like, oh, we got some power tools and some generators. We're just going to go up to this tower and cut it down. And the defenses sense a threat, speaking to our AI kind of model. Oh, there's a threat. Now I have my auditory defenses where basically I can make everyone's ears bleed and make everyone crumble.
The brown note.
Make everyone crumble to their knees.
Actually, the funniest...
I guarantee there's VC out there for this.
Yep.
Do you know the haunted house voices you can do?
Yeah.
It's a technique where if you have speakers an equal distance away from somebody's head, left and right, and you turn the waveform exactly 180 degrees on one of them, you can make it sound as if it's coming from inside your head.
Yes.
Spatially dispersed acoustical diffusion.
But in Damon there was a frequency that you could emit to humans that would like basically make your
bowels poop yourself.
Make your bowels poop yourself.
The
brown note.
Yes.
Yep. Rumored not to exist, but potentially does because classified and so forth. I think so back to the story a little bit. I think the one joke that I'd like to make here and bring a little bit of lightheartedness to us, in the 617 wireless course that I teach for SANS and have authored, and one of the parts that I did was like I make the joke about an old George Carlin joke. In that we talk about being able to do detection for like stingrays and stuff with like off-the-shelf components and you name it. And my joke is that if you set a baseline for an environment and something changes in that baseline, something is changed. Maybe a cell tower has disappeared or maybe one has stood up so you could detect stingray type of thing. And my joke is that, a cell tower just doesn't get up and walk away. Like the old George Carlin joke is, I used to lose stuff all the time, and my mom would say, it just didn't get up and walk away. And then one day I lost the cat, and I almost heard her say, it just didn't get up and... Never mind.
Carlin was amazing with his words. Yeah.
So, like, my joke is, like, cell towers just don't get up and walk away. Well, this is pretty close.
Did you guys see the story from the New Yorker that was... The gist of it was...
You know you're old when you read the New Yorker.
I don't...
Sorry.
The NSO or CIA one.
Great point. This might be one of the first New Yorker articles I've read in 20 years.
Your story number?
Old man.
my story, you guys are relentless. My story number 3, basically, Vault 8 leak was an inside job from someone who worked for the CIA as a red team operative whose handle was badass and was mentally unstable.
That's interesting. That
If that's correct, they're in a shallow grave.
No, they're in prison right now.
Okay.
I didn't read through the whole article, but the gist of the article is this person has been found to be the actual leak from this particular thing. And an operative in his last name was Schultz, and they talk about his interactions with the team, like right down to like Nerf darts, dude. Like shooting people in the face with Nerf darts kind of thing and pissing off. They show a picture of him using a contraband cell phone while in prison. Yeah,
like
I thought it was a good article. I thought it was slightly written by someone that may or may not have been around data center security in any way, shape, or form. Kind of sensationalized a little bit.
Agreed, Tyler. Yep.
Well, that's what sells newspapers or the New York.
Yeah, I mean when the facility, when they're describing the facility, surrounded by high fences, monitoring guards, armed with military grade weapons, employees entering the building through a badge-in turnstile, like. That's any and every data center I think I've ever broken into, or almost any major skyscraper.
For sure.
That's standard. But it was kind of funny. I mean, it does cover some areas that there were gaps in the understanding of where some of the other Vault 7 stuff came from, which was interesting.
Yep. And I'm also, my initial shock in this is that given the level of, quote, interrogation that you need to join one of the CIA, FBI, and so forth, I'm surprised they actually missed someone that had some pretty serious mental issues.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of the story, Larry, because there was
you talk about like
not just
PSSCI,
the target himself, but
right?
it seemed like there were other ones that they missed. Like the whole team kind of. What was striking to me in reading, I read about half the article. It's a very lengthy article, right? Was it was not all that dissimilar to interactions that you would have in a non-clearance kind of setting.
Sure.
Right? In a clearance kind of setting, doing this kind of sensitive work, I would like to believe, maybe I'm wrong with reading this article, right? That more attention is paid to the interpersonal working relationships because people are working on such sensitive work.
I would agree.
That was astonishing to me. Yeah,
that's discriminatory in some government agencies, though, right? Like the early days of this, like TSSCI, you're doing maybe a lifestyle, maybe not, but personality. Yeah, you're going to have some personality things, but they're not going to do interoperable personalities between groups because that can be discrimination between different people. Or based on personality types, right?
You're on the other side of the coin. Hang on the other side of the coin. If you go, wow, I'm feeling crappy, depressed, whatever, and you go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist to get some medication, which any regular person would go and say, give me some medication and I'll feel great. And that's wonderful. You get put on an antidepressant, you lose your clearance, period. End of story. Yep.
So people hide it. That is the underbelly of clearance.
You guys touched on a really interesting aspect of that, right? I thought you were going towards they can seek that help, but then they don't like the medication, and then they stop the medication, and I'm not a medical doctor, right? But like stopping and starting medication like that can have devastating consequences and also lead to this type of scenario. But what you're saying is you can't maintain your clearance if you have that, so you're not seeking that medical help.
They're hiding it. I mean, look, it's the same thing as, and I'll be, I'm going to point this out with.
You think Snowden? You think Snowden hid some of his medical? He had some mental health issues, as reported.
Yep.
No,
he would have lost.
I think that everybody with a clearance who's been a veteran who may have PTSD and cannot afford to lose their job hides
it.
The fact that they may have PTSD and hides it the best way they can.
Right. And that's the elephant in the room in this story. You're right. Agreed.
It is well known. Though. That's the problem. It's a well-known problem, and it is one that they've not figured out a way to address because you're right. Everyone will keep that a secret, and they all have issues. It's hard to work in a skiff day in, day out, disconnected, not being able to talk about anything that you do with anybody. Like, that poses a lot of mental hurdles that people just don't handle well.
Mm-hmm.
You've got, and look, marijuana is legal in how many states now?
Mm-hmm.
And it
20 or 30 at least.
At least, and it's proven in so many places to be
combat PTSD. No, there are studies. There are studies that prove that. Yep.
Josh, where are you going?
Well, 2 places. 1, you can't use it and work for the government,
Mm-hmm.
and 2, you can't use it and buy a firearm.
Correct.
Well, that depends on the state.
Again,
that depends on the state.
No, it does not.
It does not.
It does not.
It's a federal firearms regulation.
Federal firearms, the 4473 says, do you use marijuana or any other illegal substance? Because federally, it's illegal still.
And
if you say yes, it comes back denied.
You're right. And you know what? You answer no. But there's some other things around that, in that a number of states, they will grant you a medical marijuana card. And if you get a medical marijuana card, the answer is yes. Default. So if you have a medical marijuana card, you cannot legally buy a firearm.
Mm.
And it will deny you instantly.
Yep.
Instantly.
Yeah. But of course, there's
go drink a handle of Jack Daniels, and you could totally wield a firearm. Which shit's fucked up. Yeah.
But the deal is there's also there's other ways around that. Like, you go and get you have a medical marijuana card, and you purchase for both you and your family. Yet your significant other or your partner does not have a medical marijuana card, but they can buy firearms.
Mm-hmm.
They're just in their name, and they're in your safe.
It's crazy.
Yep. We're not commenting in any. This is a hypothetical situation.
Yes, absolutely hypothetical, and we're hackers. You think about ways around the rules.
I mean,
You're gaming
this article. I
yeah.
haven't read this entire article, but there's so much more to this article. Yeah. I implore our listeners to read it. I'm going to go back and read the whole thing, because it is a lengthy article.
I will give this a read this week.
Talks about that, and it relates to the Vault 7 leaks, which is really, really interesting. And I only got half the story because I only read about half of it, but as I'm scrolling through, I'm like, holy crap, I didn't read any of this stuff. Something about someone being implicated in child pornography, like the story takes twists and turns and all kinds of stuff. Crazy.
It's like a Vice article.
Yeah, it's even like there's some Vice articles I've read. Like
I got to tell you, I love some of those Vice articles about, like GPS spoofing, and the one that we had a while back about the hidden backdoors and some of the cryptographic technologies around like at the time of Enigma that went through the late 2000s, and they do some fantastic stuff.
I wanted to come back to Linux-based systems in this. And I'm going to dispute this with evidence.
Number 12, right?
Number 12, and I think I had another reference to it. New hard-to-detect malware attacks discovered on Linux-based systems. My argument is that this is not new, and it's not hard to detect.
Is this your also number 2? Symbiote malware infects all running processes?
Symbiote malware is what it's... Yes, this is my number 2 as well. Symbiote malware affects all running processes on Linux systems. It's basically a shared object malware. So on Windows systems, we would call this DLL injection, right? On Linux systems, it's a shared object library. I argue it is not new and it is not hard to detect. Fight me on this.
libc.
It's just a kernel level rootkit, right? This is a rootkit.
Yeah, yes, because your shared object is being loaded into the kernel, Tyler, right? And I don't have, like, my references aren't great. Like, I spent, like, maybe 15 minutes Googling this to come up with, like, a paper from ExploitDB that's like, you could take malware as a shared object and inject that shared object into the kernel, right? And there's a blog post from AT&T Labs that's like, you can hunt for Linux library injection with OS query. So there's like, it's not a new technique, nor is it really all that hard to detect, especially with BPF. BPF can monitor everything that's happening going in and out of the kernel.
Yep. This is the BPF door?
The technical...
not necessarily BPF door, Larry, but like... BPF can be used to monitor everything that's happening in the kernel. So like if you're saying this is difficult to detect, if you have something that uses BPF as a facility to monitor what's happening inside the kernel, theoretically you could detect if someone's injecting a shared library.
And I want to clarify here. BPF meaning Berkeley packet filter?
Yes, but it's a very bad moniker, right? We think of BPF,
packet meaning
generically we think of it BPF as a network,
network packet. But like we talk about something
BPF
like Wireshark.
BPF is actually a facility to monitor everything that's happening like around
it's a packet filter, but the packet doesn't need to be network. It could be interprocess, it can be whatever.
Got it. BPF is a facility to monitor everything that's happening within the kernel. Whether it's a packet, whether it's not, it's kind of got a bad kind of moniker associated with it that is specific to like TCP dump and BPF filters, right? That's not what it
its initial
describes. Maybe it was initial design, but it's been extended to say, I can monitor everything that's happening with my kernel. So which means if someone creates a malicious shared object, BPF can detect that something has been added to the kernel that is a shared object. Also, it's not a new technique to be able to create a malicious shared object and inject that into the kernel. My estimate, and our listeners correct me if I'm wrong, like, I don't think this is new. I don't think this is hard to detect. I think there are probably, my theoretical is that there are open source mechanisms. I know for a fact companies like Capsulate, I'll call out specifically, that can detect this type of behavior. So I think it's easy to detect. I also think that it is not a new technique. And the fact that this symbiote malware is being described as, oh, this is new and it's really hard to detect, is really just FUD. It's really just FUD, in my opinion.
Is that because they just, we've been writing kernel level rootkits for a very long time. A very long time. Is this because of the combination of what's being loaded and the timing for the shared objects? Because they're using the LD preload, right?
Agreed. The timing of it is suspect. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, prior to most of the shared objects being loaded, and even prior to even some of the TCP/IP stacks that get loaded, the LD preload is kind of a init kernel startup memory space that it's operating within. Now, the rootkits I typically write will always hide the traffic or the ability to list the process, show the memory space. It literally removes itself so that it cannot be found. So are they just confused because this is a rootkit in which it hides itself, which is what every good rootkit does? You can't find threads, you can't find process, you can't even find the network attacks because you're putting those into temporary directories that are bogus files and leveraging the stack outside of the visibility. So you'd have to detect it at the network level. So is it because it's stealthy or because it's a kernel level rootkit hiding itself with shared objects and when it's booting that makes it novel?
If you search for LD preload malware,
that goes back to like 2012. Like that's the stuff we were using.
It's in the MITRE attack framework, T1574.006. Hijack execution flow, dynamic linker hijacking. Like, again,
that's where you have to do it in order. If you want to hide like network,
it's not
if you want to hide your process list, if you want to hide your disk and memory space utilization, all of those things have to be done in LD preload. So it's there's some detection mechanisms there, but I think it was one of those that they just got confused on what a rootkit actually is.
Yeah, dude. Like, again, searching for LD preload malware, you can I found a paper from 2014. Again.
So the rootkits book from what was it? It was 2013, maybe 2014. Mm-hmm. That's how they have you do it, is through LD preloads. I mean, in Windows, this would be very similar to hiding to DLL. Kernel level DLL injection with memory space object removal, so you just can't actually see them. There's unlinking. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's pretty straightforward. I was interested in the fact that they found this and they only could get it back to 2021, which was also interesting. And there was no other known malware to use this, which is also interesting. Like, I'm not sure where they're getting their data sets sources from.
I think you're right, Tyler. I think it should be highlighted. I don't think it's necessarily new. I think if you're protecting Linux systems, you should definitely have facilities that protect against this. And I don't think it's hard. I don't think this is a hard thing. Again, it's like DLL injection in Windows, right? Like this should really be table stakes, in my opinion. But also, I mean, on the positive note, like good that they're kind of calling it out as something we should pay attention to.
BlackBerry's doing some cool stuff. They've got some pretty big talent working over there right now. So I actually am going to reach out and just see if I can get a little bit more detail, because I am curious from the guys working there. I would be very surprised if maybe they did a poor job of writing this up. I don't know.
Larry, I wanted to ask you about Bluetooth signals to identify and track smartphones.
Yeah.
Again, this is something that I thought was also kind of table stakes. Like if your device has Bluetooth, we can track your device. It's interesting. I don't know if you can see it behind me. You get you brought like a box of like old gear.
Yep.
And one of them was a Pony Express Pwn plug.
Pwn plug. I get the box on the arcade machine over there. We brought 2 Yasiger original pineapples before Hack 5 did the pineapples, and a rutabaga.
But I remember talking to Rick Farina, and Rick working for Pony Express at the time.
Yeah.
And going, I can tell when my mother-in-law pulls up in my driveway because her Bluetooth device has a certain signature.
Yep.
And the Pony Express infrastructure can identify that device. Yep. Therefore, I know when my mother-in-law is pulling up. Like that use case resonates with me.
Absolutely.
Because it's because it's funny, right?
Yep.
And because it's Rick, and Rick is a huge personality in our industry.
The existing projects that we'd be thinking about this would be Blue Hydra, written by Rick Farina, Zero Chaos, and some parsing of the stuff out of Blue Hydra. Also, Landmaster 53, Tim Tomes did some stuff on some of this stuff. Now, this was leveraging Bluetooth Classic.
Sure.
This one was sort of specifically around Bluetooth low energy, Bluetooth 5-ish, because they all have some incestuous relationship. I'd argue that these folks on the tracking for the Bluetooth stuff in this case went way overboard. They went to nation state level of tracking when there are much easier methods. Now, admittedly, Bluetooth Low Energy can use 2 different types of addresses, public or random. So you can randomize your BD or your MAC address with
Apple
Bluetooth
AirTags are Bluetooth.
Let's put that aside for one moment.
Okay. Okay.
Like your phone and your Android device, they all have Bluetooth Low Energy. They have a MAC address. They can have a public, which is the known, or they can have a random, and so forth. There's still a lot of correlation you can do based on the type of traffic and or those public and or random addresses, just at the Bluetooth Low Energy protocol layer.
Right. I mentioned this because my oldest son, right, lost his Apple AirPods Pro.
Yep.
But he also has a case that has the AirTag in it, right?
Yep.
So like there's a practical use case to be able to track these devices.
Yep. Completely different stuff based on this article. So on this article, they went...
AirTags is a different technology, what you're saying.
Nope. Put that aside for one moment.
Okay.
Again, the article that they did, or the paper they did here, was they actually went down and analyzed the RF signatures of the individual Bluetooth devices based on if it had this chipset with this BD adder and it did this function... So we could detect the signal.
When you say signature,
RF signatures,
you mean not just it's a combination of different data points. It's the address plus the behavior.
Layer 1.
Right.
Layer 1. When we had the ability to do a bunch of tracking and so forth at layer 2 and potentially at layer 3, they did it the hard way.
Down to the hardware.
They went down to the hardware, the RF, the transport layer.
To say like this
device,
I know it's this device because of the way it presents on the network.
Yep,
and I can track it.
And every chipset has some minor differences in the way
it's kind of like P0F, right? Like where every TCP/IP stack has like its little nuances.
Every device has a little nuance in it because of its manufacturing process and different signal strength, and they went down to the RF layer and did the detection. Like, this is nation state level version of the tracking. There's other ways of doing the tracking that are way easier.
I was going to say this was interesting, right? Like, they did a really good job. It was
they did
a novel way to do this, but we've been doing this for a long time, and the reason
we've been doing it to layer 2 and layer 3, and it's way easier.
Yeah. The reason you can get much more accurate and do this at scale across the entire Earth is because you leverage things like the Bluetooth, like the wireless. You combine that with your ad tracking ID from Apple, your MEID, and information being sent to the cell phone provider, and correlate all of those back-end mass data sets that advertisers use, that people like A6, Anomalous 6, High Noon, Ventel, they correlate and overlay and corroborate all this data, and we get precise lat longitude of real-time coordinates for a phone number, an email, a device in a location, multiple devices in a location, to drill down and say, of these devices, which one was seen at this address, and overlay and correlate all points of data, which then it becomes useful. Doing it just off the signals, that's very cool, but not really useful for hunting people right now.
Nation state level version of hunting, in my opinion. So, taking a step back to the AirTag stuff, Paul, we're going to do a tech segment. We've got one scheduled for...
You've been looking into AirTag stuff. I don't want to give too much away.
Yeah. Let's put it this way. Bluetooth Low Energy is fascinating.
I say that because without consulting with me, my wife AirTagged every single one of our dogs. I have 4 dogs, just full disclosure. Right? And my wife is very... paranoid.
Possessed.
Careful.
On their collar.
She's scarred, right? Like, because anyone who's listening, right? And you guys know, like, if you've ever lost a dog or your dog has gotten out, like, it's a traumatizing event.
And it's on a collar and not
it's
inserted, right?
Yeah, it's on their harness or collar that she took it upon. I was very proud of her. She ordered all the tags.
Well, I hope she got them at Christmas when they were on sale.
I think she did get them on sale.
I mean, that's when I got mine.
She's very frugal like that, right? She got them on sale. She got
except Larry, she doesn't buy them by the case, okay?
She bought 4, and she tagged all of our dogs. She set them up. Like, I was not involved in the process at all. I was very proud. She's like, I want to make sure we track all of our dogs. And she's like, I air tagged all of our dogs. I'm like, I am so proud of you right now. I'm like, that is really cool.
So
I'm like, but I'm also kind of enamored with how this technology, because my oldest son is always losing stuff. So she's like, I bought him a case that has an Apple AirTag that has his AirPod Pros in it, and we need to track this device as well. I'm like, I'm first proud. I'm like, second, I'm kind of creeped out that we can track all of these devices.
The Find My network is pretty darn amazing, and it's got some issues, both privacy and functionality wise.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
The Apple AirTag.
The Apple AirTags is all based around the Find My network. And the protocol is very simple.
But also Apple does some
they do some pseudo proprietary things.
They just do some weird because I'm working from home now more than I was before. And if my wife goes to work, I hear the sounds coming from all, because her phone is far away from the AirTags that are on the dogs, and I'm like, why are all these things beeping? And that's a very Apple specific thing, because of privacy reasons.
It's based around the Find My stuff and the distance and movement and whether they're registered to your account and so forth.
And as you know, I've distanced myself from Apple's ecosystem, so I'm like, what is going on right now? I have no idea what's going on.
The best part is that you talk about those privacy things, and what if someone throws an AirTag in your bag and you're an Android user?
Yes, and that's what Apple's trying to...
How do you tell?
Apple doesn't want to lose market share, but they also don't want to compromise privacy, right? So they're trying to address the scenario where someone throws an Apple tag in my bag and they're tracking me,
and you're an Android
user.
It
makes a noise because the person who owns that Apple tag is of certain distance away from an Apple tag.
Is that protocol
some shit to unpack there, man.
What's that? Open source protocol, Larry? Is that protocol open?
It is not open, but it's largely been reverse engineered, and we're going to talk about some of that in our tech segment. But to spill the beans a little bit, go check out Open Haystack is a good one that you can add your own devices. You can build your own devices on like an NRF52, if I remember correctly. You can modify an existing AirTag to basically make it so it doesn't make any noise.
Can you emulate AirTags on a phone? Say, if I wanted to build some C2 that beaconed and meshed across multiple devices via AirTag protocol in order to get out of something?
Probably not on a phone, but there are a bunch of other inexpensive hardware devices or
what if I wanted to make
general purpose computing platforms.
What if someone wanted to make it look like my dog was in the next town over?
That would be hard. Because of the security measures that Apple has implemented to prevent spoofing of AirTags.
Interesting. This is going to be you're doing a tech segment.
Yep, it's coming up.
That's going to be really.
It's going to be coming up next month.
That's really. Yeah,
dude. I will say that I feel that I am attempting to build some tools for AirTag interaction that don't exist currently. And quite honestly, awesome, I'm going to talk to you maybe this week or next. Probably this week, because I've got some issues that I'm dealing with that are simple programming problems.
But I think the use case, Larry, right, is very personal. Like,
sure. Like
my wife is like, oh, I want to AirTag all our dogs. And I'm like, hold on. Like, what does that mean? Like, what is that? How to preserve integrity in that environment? Like it begs a lot of questions.
Sure.
That I think are very valid from not just our use case, but everyone's use case. Like, hold on. Like, well, what if someone wanted to say my dog was like 10 miles away and send us into a panic? Like, that's
hard to do.
That's a security concern.
Hard to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Without spilling all the beans, hard to do.
Sure.
Based on the implementation of the AirTag security keys and how frequently they rotate. Very frequently.
So what you're saying is Apple's done a pretty good job of securing this ecosystem.
Of spoofing existing.
Yeah, because that would undermine their entire product use case in the
creating your own and detecting. They've done a pretty good job as long as you're on the Apple ecosystem. Anything outside of that is, in my opinion, a fucking nightmare. And I'm hoping to deliver a couple of solutions for folks.
One more story.
Yeah.
An acquisition of NSO. I'm gonna drop that bomb.
Your story number
7.
So I threw that story out there on...
Yeah, right, Josh? I saw this story kind of thrown out there on a lot of different forums and such. Really interesting, right? Like,
I tagged Ian.
We could talk for an hour about like NSO and the history and all that. We've covered it on the show. But like, when I saw the headline of like, what if NSO were to be acquired? Like the whole interaction with NSO as we know up to this point, it's a very interesting conversation to talk about what happens next.
I mean, the more interesting piece is who is looking to acquire it. You look at what L3 Harris has done, and the things that people don't know L3 Harris does. You know, the public stuff, obviously, stingrays and memesy catchers, and there's a lot of other stuff in much more gray areas that those guys handle.
There's some tech there, like the zero-click exploit.
With the memesy catcher.
Dude, like most of us in security are like, that was one of the coolest
and most fucking terrifying.
Like influential, like it was probably one of the most impactful and influential exploits ever, to be quite honest. Right? And now we're talking about who owns NSO, like because they're they're embroiled in like so much controversy now. Go ahead, Josh.
Go, Josh.
NSO didn't get acquired.
Yeah.
No, not yet. Not yet.
No. They're not getting acquired. You did. Okay, sorry.
Step back.
NSO is not getting bought by Harris. The business unit that controls the exploit you're specifically talking about will be taken over by Harris. NSO will continue to exist separately of that transaction.
Oh.
What?
That's what I understand.
So U.S. electronic warfare giant L3 Harris, according to sources, the leading candidate to buy the former Israeli leader in tactical interception NSO. The latter has been badly hit by American blacklisting, forced to restructure.
And then we can't get the rest of the article.
Yeah,
Create an account to read more.
Yeah, then it is kind of a weird.
And arguably, it's only 447 words after that.
Okay, so hang on, I'll throw you a link in Slack.
Yeah, please. My link sucks.
Damn it, where'd you go? There you are. Okay, try the Guardian article. Because look, take over NSO Group's hacking technology. It's not... It would take over the NSO Group's surveillance technology, but it would sell the code and transfer some people. It would not be an acquisition of the entire company. That's what I'm reading.
So, quote, the restructure is taking an arm and splitting it off, which L3 Harris would purchase.
Basically, L3 Harris would take that one product and that one product group, call it a business unit, I don't know, and take that over. But
still
NSO
terrifying.
would still exist. No, wait. Here's the interesting part. There's a lot of people that have blacklisted anybody that's ever worked at NSO from working for them. Would now Harris be
blacklisted as well? Ooh,
it'd be interesting, wouldn't it?
There's no way they could be, because they handle USS OCOM. They handle a bunch of the C5 integration pieces, as well as fighter jet aviation pieces. So they're so far integrated into the military that would put almost all projects on hold.
NSO is blacklisted by the U.S. government.
Yeah, I don't know how that works.
Yeah, but the U.S. government wants to have that functionality.
Yeah, I mean,
and L3 Harris is not the U.S. government. They're an independent contractor.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Oof.
It's going to be interesting.
As they would say up north, oofta.
The U.S. defense contractor L3 Harris is in talks to take over NSO Group's surveillance technology in a possible deal that would give American company control over one of the world's most sophisticated and controversial hacking tools, is what the article states that you shared from The Guardian.
Oofta.
I mean, it would be valuable for some of the projects that Harris works on. They are highly integrated into very strategic military applications and use cases. So for military capabilities, I would love to see our troops have the ability to do something, but the oversight and power that NSO stuff was developing is, it's terrifying. I mean, we have that inside of other government agencies, so I guess it's not that far of a stretch.
It's use your powers for good or evil, and where those lines
it's just
blur,
the fact that
right?
NSO got caught, right? That we know about it. We have that capability in other tooling. It's not as though we don't have that. Mm-hmm. It's just we haven't gotten caught with it.
That probably one of the most political articles, right? Like, how do you navigate those waters? Crazy. Well, cool. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching this edition of Paul's Security Weekly. Larry, take us out.
Over and out of here.